There is a place on this planet that human beings know less about than the surface of Mars, a place that fewer people have reached than those who have walked on the moon, where the pressure of the water is equivalent to the weight of 50 airplanes crushing every square centimeter of your body. And that place is not in outer space. It is here on Earth, less than 11 kilometers below the surface of the Pacific Ocean. It is called the Mariana Trench. And for most of human history, it has been so inaccessible, so dark, and so extreme that scientists assumed it was dead, that nothing could survive there. But they were wrong. What inhabits that depth, how it survives, and what its existence implies for everything we believe we know about life in the universe is one of the most extraordinary stories science has ever told, and it has not finished telling it yet. In all of human history, only 22 people have reached it. To understand the Mariana Trench, you first have to understand everything that must be crossed to reach it. The ocean is not a uniform space. It is a series of worlds stacked one on top of another, each more hostile than the last, each with its own rules, its own creatures, and its own limits for life. The descent begins at the surface. The first 200 meters are the only part of the ocean that human beings truly know. Sunlight, warmth, color. Dolphins, sea turtles, and tuna live here. It is the ocean of movies and diving documentaries. It is, in terms of total depth, a layer of paint on an enormous wall. Because everything interesting, everything truly strange begins just when the light goes out. At 200 meters, sunlight becomes a memory. The temperature drops. The pressure is equivalent to 10 times what is felt at the surface, enough to compress the lungs of any diver without protective equipment until they collapse. The world record for free diving, the deepest dive performed by a human on a single breath, was set at 214 meters. That is exactly where the mesopelagic zone begins, what oceanographers call the twilight zone. Here lives the lanternfish, a small fish only a few centimeters long that produces its own light to communicate in the darkness, and the glass squid, almost completely transparent, whose body lets the little remaining light pass through, so it does not cast a shadow, and thus is not seen by predators watching from below. Descending to the bottom of this zone at 1,000 meters is already impossible for any human body without a submersible. Beyond 1,000 meters, the darkness is total and permanent. No ray of sunlight has ever reached this depth. The pressure is equivalent to 100 times that at the surface. In this zone, known as the bathypelagic or midnight zone, animals produce their own light. Bioluminescence is a fundamental survival tool. The viperfish has light-producing organs along its entire body that it uses to attract prey in the darkness. The humpback cuttlefish has the ability to change not only color, but also the texture of its skin, although in this darkness it uses that ability more to detect vibrations than for visual camouflage. And here as well is the black sea devil, whose female carries an organ hanging above her head that lights up like a lure to attract prey. At 4,000 meters, the temperature approaches 2 degrees Celsius, and the darkness is absolute. Here begins the abyssal zone, the ocean floor for 95% of the planet, a place where life exists but only just. For almost any living being on Earth, this is the limit of what is possible. The Mariana Trench has not begun yet. At 6,000 meters, the Hadal zone begins, named after the Greek god of the underworld, Hades. This zone does not exist in most of the ocean. It appears only in the deepest tectonic trenches on the planet, with the Mariana Trench being the deepest of all. The pressure exceeds 600 times atmospheric pressure. The most advanced military submarines in the world, including nuclear-powered ones, cannot reach here. And finally, after 11 kilometers of darkness and cold, the bottom is reached. Challenger Deep, the lowest point of the Earth's crust. The Mariana Trench is not a geological anomaly. It is the inevitable result of a collision that has been occurring since before the dinosaurs existed. Beneath the western Pacific Ocean, 2 tectonic plates have been colliding for millions of years. The Pacific Plate moves slowly westward until it meets the Mariana Plate, smaller and less dense. Physics causes the denser plate to sink beneath the other in a process called subduction, tearing the ocean floor downward. And the crust that sinks here is 170 million years old, the same age as the dinosaurs of the Jurassic. The older and denser the crust, the deeper the tear. That is the secret of the trench. It is not that it is especially large. It is that the crust that forms it is the oldest on the planet. The most important thing to understand is that it is not a fossil, it is a living process. Subduction is still occurring today. The Pacific Plate is still sinking. The trench is a window open in real time into the interior of the Earth. And in that interior, under a pressure that crushes steel and in a darkness where not a single photon of sunlight reaches, something happens that no scientist would have predicted. Life not only endures, it grows. One of the most counterintuitive phenomena in the entire deep ocean is gigantism, the most hostile place on the planet where pressure crushes steel, where there is no light and barely any food, is also the place where some creatures reach sizes impossible in any other environment. The abyss produces giants, and understanding why reveals something fundamental about how life works when pushed to the extreme. The first factor is the cold. At great depths, the temperature remains around 2 or 3 degrees Celsius. Extreme cold slows the metabolism of cold-blooded animals almost to a halt. A slow metabolism means the animal uses very little energy, ages more slowly, and therefore grows for much longer. Some deep water sharks, such as the Greenland shark, have been known to live for more than 400 years. An adult individual could have been born before Isaac Newton formulated the laws of gravity. And throughout all that time, it has not stopped growing. The second factor is pressure and the lack of competition. In the depths, resources are scarce, but predators are as well. A larger body can travel greater distances in search of food, can store more energy between meals, and can be harder to hunt. In an environment where food may take days to appear, size is a strategic advantage. This effect does not only affect animals that are already large, it also transforms the small ones. Isopods at the surface measure only a few millimeters. In the depths of the ocean, the giant isopod reaches up to 50 centimeters in length and can weigh several kilograms. The same family, the same basic design multiplied by the logic of the abyss, but this effect has a limit, and that limit is the Hadal zone. Beyond 6,000 meters in depth, gigantism begins to reverse. The reason is both brutal and elegant. More body mass means more surface area that pressure can compress. At pressures of more than 600 atmospheres, every square centimeter of living tissue is a potential point of collapse. A small organism with less surface area and fewer internal parts that can fail has a greater chance of surviving than a large one. In addition, at these depths, food is so scarce that maintaining a large body is energetically impossible. The giants of the abyssal zone do not descend into the Hadal zone, not because they cannot try, but because if they did, they would die. What inhabits the bottom of the Mariana Trench are not the largest monsters in the ocean, but the most resilient. Creatures that have had millions of years to adapt to conditions that no other environment offers, and whose result is a bestiary that seems designed by an imagination without limits. These do not resemble anything evolution has produced anywhere else on Earth. In the abyssal zone, just before the trench itself begins, lives one of the most disturbing animals ever captured by a submersible camera, the Magnapina squid. It has a relatively small body from which tentacles extend that can reach up to 7 meters in length. But what is truly disconcerting is not its size, but its geometry. Its tentacles do not hang downward or extend to the sides, but instead form a perfect right angle with the body. The image is that of a creature that seems to be waiting, motionless, in the darkness. No one knows for certain what it uses this posture for. The most widely accepted hypothesis is that the tentacles act as a passive trap, detecting or capturing whatever brushes against them in the current. What is known is that no adult has ever been captured alive. Everything we know about this species comes from brief recordings and juvenile specimens. At several thousand meters deep also lives the giant phantom jellyfish. It is one of the largest organisms known on the planet. Its bell can exceed 10 meters in diameter, and from it extend tentacles in the form of wide, flat ribbons, completely different from the filaments of coastal jellyfish. It does not have stinging cells and therefore does not sting. Instead of paralyzing its prey, it wraps them with those ribbons and slowly drags them toward its mouth. In 100 years of ocean exploration, fewer than 100 confirmed sightings of this species have been recorded. But if there is one creature that defines the paradox of the Hadal Zone, it is the Mariana snailfish. Its name is misleading because it is neither slow nor armored. It is a small fish, about 20 to 30 centimeters long, almost completely translucent. It has no scales. Its skeleton is not made of bone but of soft cartilage. If you brought it to sea level, atmospheric pressure would cause its body to collapse. And yet, it is the deepest living vertebrate ever found on Earth. It has been recorded at more than 8,000 meters deep. What makes its survival possible is exactly what would make it vulnerable anywhere else. Its body does not resist pressure, it adapts to it. Instead of fighting the crushing force, it incorporates it. Its cells contain extraordinarily high concentrations of a chemical compound called TMAO that stabilizes proteins under extreme pressure. The deeper it lives, the more TMAO it has in its tissues. Its theoretical physiological limit, calculated from the maximum possible concentration of that compound, is approximately 8,200 meters. Beyond that, not even it can survive. At the very bottom of the trench-live Hadal amphipods, crustaceans similar to small shrimp that can reach 20 centimeters in the most extreme depths. They are efficient scavengers. When something dies and sinks to the bottom, amphipods can detect it from kilometers away and arrive in large numbers. But the most surprising thing about these animals is not their behavior, but their chemistry. Scientists who analyzed their exoskeletons found something that had never been seen in any other animal on Earth: aluminum structurally incorporated into their bodies, not as a contaminant, but as a biological construction material. Amphipods extract aluminum from the sediments on the seabed and integrate it into their exoskeleton to reinforce it under pressure. It is an engineering solution that no other living being on the planet has developed independently. And then there are xenophyophories, single-celled organisms, which means their entire body is contained within a single cell. But that cell can reach 10 centimeters in diameter, making them one of the largest single cells on Earth. What makes them truly extraordinary is what they do with their environment. They collect grains of sand, fragments of minerals, and small bits of seabed sediment, and assemble them around themselves, forming a protective structure. A single cell that creates microhabitats where even smaller organisms can take refuge. In one of the most barren places on the planet, xenophyophories act as ecosystem engineers. And in the trench, even the way of feeding forces everything to be reinvented. For decades, scientists assumed that life on the ocean floor ultimately depended on the sun. Not directly, because light does not reach those depths, but indirectly. Phytoplankton at the surface photosynthesizes dyes, and its remains slowly sink to the bottom in the form of small organic particles. Oceanographers call this process marine snow. It is an invisible rain of organic matter, fragments of dead organisms, feces, and plankton remains that descend for weeks from the surface to the seabed. For most animals of the abyss, this snow is the only available food. The entire bottom ecosystem in its most basic form is a recycling chain that depends on what falls from above. But there are creatures that do not wait for anything to fall, that do not need the sun, not even indirectly, that have found a completely different source of energy, buried in the ocean floor itself. In 2021, the Chinese Fendu expedition, which carried out 33 systematic dives in the trench, discovered something scientists did not expect to find at that depth: entire communities of organisms living around cracks in the seabed through which methane and other chemical gases from the Earth's interior seep. These communities do not depend on photosynthesis, They depend on chemosynthesis, a process in which specialized bacteria extract energy directly from chemical reactions. What the expedition found were not a few isolated organisms. They were ecosystems, dense colonies of tube worms up to 30 centimeters long, anchored to the ground and fed by chemosynthetic bacteria that live inside them in a symbiotic relationship. Fields of clams so closely packed that they covered the sediment like a living pavement. Carpets of bacteria forming visible layers over the rocks on the seabed, producing methane under conditions that were considered incompatible with any form of complex metabolism. Scientists described what they saw as a river of life flowing along the floor of the trench. The implication of this discovery goes far beyond. If life can build entire ecosystems without sunlight, then the conditions required for life are far less restrictive than previously thought. Beneath the icy surface of Europa, a moon of Jupiter, there is a liquid ocean heated by the moon's internal geological activity. On Enceladus, a moon of Saturn, geysers have been detected ejecting water vapor and organic compounds into space. Both environments are, in essence, similar to the cracks at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. The trench is not only the deepest point on Earth, it is the closest laboratory to what an alien ocean might be. The Fendu expedition identified in its sediment samples more than 7,000 new microbial species, 89% of them completely unknown to science. Species with their own survival strategies, with biochemistries different from anything known, thriving in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. What for centuries seemed like a sterile desert turns out to be one of the most diverse ecosystems science has ever found, and yet we barely know how to reach it. In all of human history, only 22 people have reached the Challenger Deep. It is a number so small that it is difficult to process, but behind it there are 3 moments that define how the human species approached, slowly and with enormous difficulty, the deepest place on its own planet. The first occurred on January 23, 1960. The Swiss oceanographer Jacques Piccard and U.S. Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh descended inside a steel sphere barely 2 meters in diameter aboard the bathyscaphe Trieste. They carried no cameras, they carried no sampling instruments. The objective was a single one, to prove that a human being could reach the bottom and return. The descent lasted almost 5 hours, and when they were at 9,000 meters deep, one of the external windows of the bathyscaphe cracked with a bang that shook the entire structure. Even so, Walsh and Piccard decided to continue. When they reached the bottom, at 10,916 meters deep, they had exactly 20 minutes before they had to begin the ascent. And in those 20 minutes, through the small viewing port of the sphere, they saw something move over the sediment. A flat animal, similar to a sole, moving slowly along the bottom. When they came back up and reported it, many scientists did not believe them. A fish at that depth seemed impossible to them. They had no photos to prove it, only the word of 2 men who had been where no one had been before. After that moment, no one returned for a long time. The technology was too difficult to maintain, the cost too high, and the scientific return, with a single sphere without instruments, too limited to justify it. The bottom of the trench remained frozen in that single memory of 20 minutes for more than half a century. The second act occurred on March 26, 2012, when James Cameron, the same director who brought Titanic to the screen and who explored the wreck of the real ship with research submersibles, descended alone in a self-designed submersible called Deep Sea Challenger. The capsule was shaped like a vertical torpedo, painted bright green, and was so narrow that Cameron could not extend his arms. The descent took 2.5 hours, and when he reached the bottom, he described it as lunar, desolate. A flat expanse of fine gray sediment stretching in all directions with no large animals visible. But what he brought back was far more valuable than what his eyes saw. Sediment samples that in laboratories revealed 68 new species, most of them bacteria. However, a failure in the hydraulic system disabled the sampling robotic arm ahead of time. and Cameron had to begin the ascent after only 3 hours on the bottom. 3 hours in the deepest place on Earth to return with enough material to rewrite several pages of marine biology. The third came in 2019, and it was different from the previous ones in an essential way. Victor Vescovo, an American explorer and entrepreneur, did not go once. He went 20 times. Aboard the submersible limiting factor, Vescovo set the record for the greatest depth reached, approaching 10,928 meters. But what was truly significant was not the record, but the systematic approach. For the first time in history, the trench was explored methodically, covering different sectors of the bottom, mapping its topography, collecting samples under controlled conditions. His team identified 4 new species of amphipods, documented rocky outcrops of vivid colors that indicated active geological activity on the bottom, and filmed ecosystems that no human eye had ever seen. It was the most complete exploration ever carried out of the deepest point on Earth. And in one of those dives, Vescovo saw something he did not expect to see. Something that had no scientific or geological justification for being there. At nearly 11 kilometers deep, in the most remote and least accessible place on the planet, there was a plastic bag. It was not an isolated incident. When his team analyzed in the laboratory the tissues of the animals collected during the dives, they found microplastics in all of them, without exception. Fragments of plastic that had descended for weeks from the surface and had been biologically incorporated by the creatures of the deepest point on Earth. The levels of contaminants found in some of those crustaceans were comparable to those detected in crabs from the most polluted industrial rivers in China. The same concentration of poison in the most isolated place on the planet and in one of the most contaminated by human industry. If pollution has reached the bottom of the Mariana Trench, it has reached everywhere. There is no corner of the ocean, no matter how remote or deep, that is beyond the reach of what human beings discard at the surface. But the human footprint does not end with pollution. In recent years, something has changed in the way nations look toward the ocean floor, no longer only as an object of scientific curiosity, increasingly as a resource and as a territory. Between August and November 2021, the Chinese submersible Fengdu carried out 33 dives in the Mariana Trench, the most intense systematic exploration campaign ever conducted in that environment. It was a demonstration of technical capability, but also a statement of intent. While countries like the United States reduced the budgets of their ocean research agencies, China invested in fleets of autonomous robots capable of operating at great depths without a pilot, at a fraction of the cost of crude submersibles. The deep ocean floor is covered with polymetallic nodules, rocks that contain cobalt, nickel, copper, and manganese in concentrations that do not exist in any known terrestrial deposit. These are the essential metals for manufacturing electric vehicle batteries, solar panels, and renewable energy storage systems. The country that controls their extraction will control a decisive part of the global energy transition. China has announced plans to build a permanent base at 2,000 meters deep, designed to house 6 scientists for stays of up to 30 days. It is not a conventional research laboratory. It provides access to something no short-term mission can offer: time. Time to observe, to measure, to understand the environment with the depth that only permanence provides. In 2025, China publicly presented an underwater robot equipped with a cable-cutting system. The official explanation was that it was designed to repair damaged infrastructure on the seafloor. But 97% of global internet traffic, global financial communications, and the military communications systems of major powers travel through submarine cables laid along the ocean floor. They are physical lines, fragile, and largely invisible to any conventional surveillance system. A robot capable of operating at thousands of meters in depth, beyond the reach of any immediate response, and equipped to cut cables, is something that changes the way states think about the security of their critical infrastructure. There is no evidence that this robot has been used for that purpose, but the possibility has been enough for several governments to reconsider what sovereignty at the bottom of the ocean really means. A place that for centuries was synonymous with the unreachable has become, in just a few decades, the next territory in dispute. And while states look downward, calculating what they can extract or control, the trench has spent millions of years teaching a lesson we still have not finished learning. For centuries, human beings assumed that life had conditions, that it needed light, moderate heat, clear limits of pressure and temperature beyond which it simply could not exist. The trench has shown that each of those limits was a projection of our own fragility, not a universal law. It is not a place where life survives despite the conditions. It is a place where the conditions have generated forms of life that would not have existed in any other environment. And that changes the question we have been asking about the universe for centuries. If life can flourish here, what does it really need to appear? How many frozen oceans, how many cracks on the floors of moons we have never set foot on, have spent millions of years harboring something we still do not know how to look for? But first, it is worth looking at what we have done with the life that already exists on our own world. We are the only species that has managed to alter a place before being able to reach it. That left its mark on an ecosystem before having the slightest idea of what that ecosystem was. We still do not know what exists across most of that seabed. The trench remains, in essence, unknown. If you liked the documentary, I recommend that you subscribe to join us on this journey. Comment on what you would like the next investigation to be about. A hug, and see you in the next one.